September 1942, Dowfield Banganger, Maine. The cold Atlantic wind blew across the tarmac as 10 young men stood under the shiny aluminum wings of a brand-new Boeing B-17F Flying Fortress. Captain Robert K. Morgan, a tall, thin pilot from Asheville, North Carolina, ran his hand along the side of serial number 4124485, feeling the rivets under his hand. This plane had joined the USAF on July 15, 1942, and was delivered in September 1942 to the 91st Bombardment Group. What none of these men realized was they were about to be part of the most famous bomber crew in American history, not through Hollywood stories, but through the harsh reality of surviving against odds that seemed impossible. The crew would fly their B-17 across the Atlantic to England to join the 324th Bombardment Squadron of the 91st Bombardment Group at RAF Bassingbourn. But first, Morgan promised his crew a stop. They flew south to Tennessee to the city that would give their plane its name. There in Memphis, Morgan named the bomber after his girlfriend Margaret Pull, though he first wanted to call it Little One, his pet name for her. After watching a movie where a character had a riverboat called Memphis Belle, the name stuck. Young Margaret Polk became an accidental icon, her face soon to appear on the nose of a bomber that would face death over occupied Europe. The Memphis Belle moved to Prestwick, Scotland on September 30, 1940, moving to a temporary base at RAF Kimballton on October 1, before reaching its permanent base at RAF Bassingbourn, England on October 14. The base just north of London in the soft countryside of Cambridge would be their home for the next 7 months. What awaited them was a test of endurance that would push human bravery to its absolute limit. The numbers were terrifying. When America joined the war in Europe, flying missions from English bases, losses were as high as 82%. In interviews much later, Morgan described the horror, explaining the terrible casualties. 80% losses means you have breakfast with 10 men and dinner with only 2. The War Department had set a combat tour limit. Crews had to complete this many missions before they could go home. But in those early dark days of late 1942 and early 1943, reaching that number seemed impossible. Of those who flew the original 25 mission bomber in 1942 to 1943, only 35% survived. November 7, 1942. The crew of the Memphis Belle flew their first combat mission, hitting submarine pens at Brest, France. They took off from Bassingbourn in the pre-dawn dark as part of a group of B-17s crossing the English Channel. The young men had trained for months, but nothing could get them ready for what was coming. The United States Army Air Forces joined World War II using daylight precision, bombing taught at the Aurora Tactical School at Maxwell Field, Alabama. The Air Force went into World War II and unescorted daylight precision bombing without having any long-range escort fighter in its plans. The British expected terrible losses on daylight raids, and they were right. American P-47 Thunderbolts and Royal Air Force Spitfires gave only short-range escort. And when these fighters reached their limit near the western edge of Germany, they turned back, leaving the American bombers exposed to the German Luftwaffe. 2 days after their first mission on November 9th, they flew to Saint-Nazaire, and again on November 17th. The American bomb groups were taking on tough, well-defended targets, including submarine pens at Saint-Nazaire, and Brest docks and shipbuilding sites at Wilhelmshaven, railroad yards at Rouen, and aircraft factories at Antwerp. The German submarine pens' huge concrete buildings made to protect U-boat from bombing were almost impossible to destroy. Yet the 8th Air Force kept sending bombers against them. December brought winter and more missions. On December 6th, they hit locomotive works at Lille, France. On December 20th, they bombed the airfield at Romolissin. Each mission was a gamble. Each time they came back to Bassingbourn. They counted the empty dispersal hard stands where planes that left that morning would never come back. The Memphis Belle herself was taking heavy damage. On 5 different missions, she had engines shot out once. She returned with her tail almost destroyed. She was full of bullet holes and flak damage. Yet not one crew member was seriously hurt. This alone seemed impossible. 1943 started with no break. January 3rd found them back over Césaire. January 13th took them to Lille. On January 23rd, they hit submarine pens at Lorient, in the flak-filled sky above the German U-boat base. At Lorient, on January 23rd, 1943, Memphis Belle was fighting for her life, moving through a screen of German fighters and then through a thick layer of anti-aircraft fire, holding steady without any evasive moves. It was late January 1943 when Hollywood showed up at Bassingbourn Major William Wyler, who had made famous films like Wuthering Heights and Mrs. Miniver, joined the U.S. Army Air Force to make documentaries about the war in Europe. Morgan writes in his memoirs that Wyler approached him in late January 1943 after his crew's 8th mission. Wyler told Morgan he wanted to film the Memphis Belle and her crew because of a special charm to the plane's nickname, and that Morgan's skill as a pilot meant Wyler would be in the action with a good chance of returning. Wyler had been following Captain Oscar O'Neill, whose bomber was named Invasion 2nd of the 4001st Bomb Squadron. But on April 17, 1943, O'Neill's fate was sealed. O'Neill's B-17 and 5 others of the 4001st were shot down over Bremen, Germany, in what was then the deadliest mission so far for the 8th Air Force. Wyler needed a new subject. Morgan and the Memphis Belle became his focus. February 4th brought their 9th mission to Medan, Germany. Their first strike into Germany itself, February 14th, had them attack Ham, Germany. Then, on February 16th, the Memphis Belle took heavy damage over Saint-Nazaire. The Memphis Belle was being fixed after serious damage from February 16th, while ground crews worked on the plane. Wyler's first filmed mission was not on the Memphis Belle, but on the B-17 Jersey Bounce, on February 26, 1943, to Wilhelmshaven, Germany, while the Memphis Belle was repaired. The mission faced strong German fighter attacks and 2 of the 91st Group's B-17s were shot down. Despite the danger, Wyler filmed at least 6 more combat missions with Morgan's crew. Not all on the Memphis Belle, using cameras in the nose-tail right waist and radio hatch. The cost of filming this war was in lives. First Lieutenant Harold J. Tannenbaum, a World War I veteran, and one of 3 cinematographers, was killed in action when the bomber he was in was shot down over France on April 16, 1943. Wyler got frostbite and lost his hearing for months after bombing runs. Back in combat, the Memphis Belle crew kept adding missions. March brought strikes to Lorient on the 6th, Rouen on the 12th and 13th, Wilhelmshaven on the 22nd, and back to Rouen on the 28th. April brought missions to Antwerp on the 5th, Lorient on the 16th, and the deadly Bremen raid on the 17th May took them to Saint-Nazaire on the 1st, and Antwerp on the 4th. By mid-May 1943, they were close to the limit. The race was on among several bombers to finish their combat tours. A B-17F, called Delta Rebel, No. 2, completed 25 credited missions. On May 1, 1943, becoming the first B-17 in the European theater to do so, Hell's Angels, a B-17F of the 3003rd Bombardment Group, completed 25 missions on May 13, 1943. But neither plane would return to the United States for a publicity tour. The Memphis Belle crew reached that milestone without losing a crew member, making her the likely first to come home for a war bond tour. Sadly, Delta Rebel No. 2 was shot down on August 12, 1943 during a mission to Gelsenkirchen, Germany, with 6 crew taken prisoner and 4 killed in action. May 15th brought their 24th mission to Wilhelmshaven. Just one more mission, and they would finish. Wyler's film showed this next to last mission on May 15th, 1943. Wyler told Morgan that if the Memphis Belle had been shot down on the crew's final mission, he had a backup crew ready on another B-17 about to complete its 25 missions. Hell's Angels of the nearby 3003rd Bombardment Group. May 17, 1943. The Memphis Belle flew her 25th and final combat mission, hitting the huge Cameraman submarine base at Lorient, France. She flew 148 hours, 50 minutes, and traveled more than 20,000 combat miles during her 25 missions. During those 25 missions, Memphis Belle gunners were credited with shooting down 8 enemy fighters, with another 5 probable kills, and damaging at least 12 more. Her crew dropped over 60 tons of bombs over France, Germany, and Belgium. They did it. They beat the odds. The crew received the Distinguished Flying Cross the Air Medal, and 3 oak leaf clusters each. Only tail gunner staff. Sergeant John P. Quinlan got a Purple Heart for being officially wounded King George V, wearing a Royal Air Force Marshal uniform, and Queen Elizabeth congratulated the crew on May 18th. 10 young Americans stood before the King and Queen of England, men who had brought the war to Nazi Germany and survived. The Memphis Belle was flown back to the United States on June 8, 1943, by a mixed crew chosen by the 8th Air Force, led by Captain Morgan for a 31-city war bond. Tour Morgan's original co-pilot, Captain James A. Varinas, had flown Memphis Belle for one mission, before being promoted to aircraft commander of another B-17 called Connecticut Yankee, for his final 16 missions, finishing his tour on May 13th. But he rejoined Morgan's crew as co-pilot for the flight back to the United States. The crew that completed the tour represented America. They ranged in age from 19 to 26 and came from states across the U.S., including Washington, Indiana, Texas, and Connecticut. Captain Robert K. Morgan, the pilot from Asheville, North Carolina, was 24 years old. Captain James A. Varinas from Woodbridge, Connecticut. Captain Charles B. Layton, navigator from Flint, Michigan. Captain Vincent B. Evans, bombardier from Fort Worth, Texas. Technical Sergeant Robert J. Hansen, radio operator from Walla Walla, Washington. Technical Sergeant Harold P. Loach, top turret gunner and engineer from Green Bay, Wisconsin. Staff Sergeant Cecile H. Scott, ball turret gunner from Arapcho, North Carolina staff. Sergeant John P. Quinlan Tail, gunner from Yonkers, New York. Staff Sergeant Kasema, a Nastal waist gunner from Detroit, Michigan. Staff Sergeant Clarence E. Winchell, waist gunner from Oak Park, Illinois. Notably, missing was Staff Sergeant E. Scott Miller, the right waist gunner from Kingwood, West Virginia. Miller flew 15 missions on the Belle, but missed the tour because he had not flown 25 missions. Yet while his crewmates were celebrated across America, Miller stayed in England flying combat missions until he completed his own tour. His contribution would be overlooked for decades. Also with them was Stucker, a Scottish terrier bought by co-pilot Jim Vinnis in a London pet store, went along with the crew and joined the tour. In a war so big and horrible, the presence of this little dog gave a bit of normalcy. The crew visited more than 32 cities where they got hero welcomes, including Washington, Cleveland, Los Angeles, Wichita, and mobile bond rallies were held across the country. But the Memphis Belle crew brought something different than Hollywood stars. They were men who had faced death over and over and lived in Captain Morgan's hometown of Asheville on the final night. The city leaders held a party and reception at City Hall Auditorium where each crew member spoke. Morgan, feeling sentimental, talked about mountain moonshine and promised to fly it around the country after the war. The local people loved it. These young men barely out of their teens had become symbols of American bravery. At every stop, crowds showed up. People wanted to touch the plane, see the bullet holes and flak damage, and meet the men who had flown her. The tour had 3 goals, so that combat crews in training could learn to be effective in battle, so that factory workers could see what they were building being used, and so that Americans could understand what the war was about. But the tour also showed tensions under the heroic story. It was hard for Jim Vinnes, as it started his life living in Bob Morgan's shadow, something he did for the rest of his life because the press always called him Memphis Belle's co-pilot, even though he had commanded Connecticut Yankee for 20 missions and reached 25 missions before Morgan. The story needed a single hero, and Morgan was that the crew dynamics were simplified for storytelling. The relationship between Morgan and Margaret Polk also suffered, and they broke up during the tour. The young romance that gave the plane its name could not survive fame, and the changes war caused in them. After 3 months touring America, the Memphis Belle's combat days were done. On December 23, 1943, the Memphis Belle was sent to MacDill, Florida to be a B-17 aircrew and ground crew training plane, staying there until after victory in Europe Day. The plane that had survived combat would now teach others how to survive their own missions. The bomber that had faced German flak, and fighters would spend the rest of the war preparing new crews for what awaited them over Europe. After VE Day, the plane was flown to Altus Army Airfield, Oklahoma, for storage and eventual reclamation. In fields across America, thousands of planes waited for scrappers. The industrial power that made them now had no use for them. The Memphis Belle seemed destined for the same fate as thousands of other warbirds, to be cut up and melted. But the mayor of Memphis, Walter Chandler, stepped in, arranging for the city to buy the B-17 for $350. $350 less than the fuel cost of a single mission. It was flown to Memphis in July 1946 and stored until mid-1949. When it was put on display at the National Guard Armory near the fairgrounds, it stayed outdoors into the 1980s, slowly deteriorating from weather and vandalism. The famous bomber that had survived German fighters and flak was now being destroyed by something worse. Neglect and time paint peeled aluminum. Corroded vandals left marks. The Memphis Belle, sitting outside in Memphis, was slowly dying. After persistent work by Frank D'Onofrio, a local businessman, the city agreed to give land on Mud Island where the historic bomber could be displayed. Federal Express and Boeing each gave $100,000 toward restoration, and the city gave $150,000 when Hugh Diaz of TV's 2020 aired. The need for more money. The American people gave the rest of the $576,000 needed. On May 17, 1987, 44 years after she flew her 25th mission, the Memphis Belle Pavilion was dedicated with nearly 25,000 people attending 7 B-17s. The largest formation since World War II flew overhead in salute and dropped thousands of rose petals on the pavilion. Margaret Polk and the Belle crew watched as the crowd cheered loudly. It was a moment of triumph, the famous bomber finally getting the care and respect it deserved. Margaret Polk, who helped raise funds for the association, died in 1990, but the outdoor display on Mud Island, while well-intended, could not give the controlled environment needed for long-term preservation. In 2004, the National Museum of the United States Air Force said they wanted it back for restoration and eventual display at Wright-Patterson AFB near Dayton, Ohio. The Belle arrived at the museum in mid-October 2005 and was placed in one of the museum's restoration hangars, having been trucked in corroded pieces after Memphis's efforts ran out of money. What followed was one of the most careful aircraft restorations in history. It took 55,000 hours to restore the plane to its wartime condition. 55,000 hours of detailed, painstaking work by people who understood its importance. More than 100 people, mostly volunteers, worked on the 4-engine bomber. After removing paint from the aft fuselage, Hundreds of names and personal messages were found scratched into the aluminum skin. These scratches left by visitors over decades told their own story. People had wanted to leave their mark to somehow connect themselves to this famous plane. Restoration specialist Casey Simmons said priority one was getting it right, making even parts no visitor would ever see, like a glycol heater missing from inside. The left wing. The restoration team was determined to make the plane complete and authentic, even in parts no one would see. Many parts long out of production made restorers create new parts by hand, sometimes using only a fragment of an old part, or without blueprints. These skilled craftsmen were not just repairing an old airplane. They were keeping a piece of history safe so future generations could see and understand what the men of the 8th Air Force had flown into battle. On March 14, 2018, the Memphis Belle was moved into the museum's World War II gallery at a private event, and was officially shown 2 months later on May 17, 2018, the 75th anniversary of completing its 25th mission. Robert K. Morgan Jr.'s voice shook with emotion when he spoke about seeing the Memphis Belle fully assembled for the first time in 50 years. His father had flown the famous B-17F on 25 dangerous bombing missions and spent the rest of his life making sure the plane was preserved. Morgan Jr. said his father knew before he died that the plane would go to the museum, that it could not stay in Memphis, and he was very happy it would be preserved and restored there. The documentary William Wyler made became part of the Memphis Belle's lasting legacy. The 16mm color film used had no sound, which was added later in Hollywood. The original crew during their war bond tour made comments to each other while watching the silent movie in a studio, making it hard to tell from real combat footage. Over 15 hours of film shot by Wyler and his cinematographers are at the National Archives. In 2016, documentary filmmaker Eric Nelson learned that the 34 reels of raw footage were available at the National Archives. He led a team that fixed scratched and faded frames, and after restoration used the 90 hours of film to make a new documentary called The Cold Blue. The crew members lived full lives after the war, though they carried memories that set them apart. Robert K. Morgan was hospitalized on April 22, 2004, with a broken vertebra in his neck after falling outside the Asheville Regional Airport, returning from an air show. He died at Mission Hospital on May 15, 2004, from complications of his injuries, including pneumonia. James Averinas died on March 3, 2003. Seal Scott retired from Ford Motor Company. After 30 years, dying in 1979, the other crew members returned to normal civilian lives, became fathers and grandfathers, worked regular jobs, and lived in suburbs across America. But the Memphis Belle's story was never just about one crew or one plane. A total of 350,000 airmen served with the 8th Air Force in England, and 26,000 were killed, a rate of 7.42%. Compared to other military branches, U.S. Marines 3.29%, U.S. Army 2.25%, and U.S. Navy 0.41%. The Air Force suffered the heaviest losses. More airmen with the 8th Air Force died than the entire Marine Corps, whose enrollment had 250,000 more people. Strictly measuring mortality for the 210,000 aircrewmen, the casualty rate rises to 12.38%, with 21,000 ending up in prisoner of war camps. The 250,000 aircrew members who flew bomber missions in the 8th Air Force suffered 58,000 casualties, including 18,000 killed, 6,500 wounded, and 33,500 missing. In the middle of the heaviest combat against Germany, U.S. bomber crew airmen had a 1 in 4 chance of survival. Think about that. 1 in 4. If you were a bomber crewman in early 1943, you had the same odds of surviving as a coin coming up heads twice in a row. The Memphis Belle crew defied these odds not once or twice but more than 20 times. On some missions, losses were catastrophic, with the Pesty mission in August 1943 seeing 30% losses, and the Schweinfurt mission in October seeing 28% losses. After Schweinfurt, the B-17s did not fly deep into Germany again until long-range P-51 fighters could escort them. The doctrine of unescorted daylight precision bombing was too costly. The North American P-51 Mustang became effective when it became the P-51B, after its American Allison engine was replaced by the Packard supercharged version of the British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine in late 1942. With the first P-51BC fighters entering service in England in December 1943, had the P-51 been available earlier, thousands of airmen might have been saved. For the bomber offensive overall, the 8th Air Force lost 4,182 aircraft from a total of 273,841, attacking a rate of 1.5%. Yet even at 1.5% when crews flew multiple missions, the math was brutal. By 1945, the 8th Air Force flew at lower altitudes and put up to 60% of bombs within 1,000 feet of the target, almost 4 times better than in the dark days of 1943. The campaign evolved, improved, and succeeded, but success came at a terrible cost. Morgan remembered no easy missions, no milk runs. Every mission meant flying through flak so thick it looked like you could walk on it. Every mission meant German fighters attacking in waves. Every mission meant watching other bombers go down, seeing parachutes blossom against the sky, counting the chutes, and knowing not everyone made it out. At 25,000 feet, temperatures reached 40 to 50 below zero. Frostbite was common. The oxygen was thin, requiring masks that often failed. The plane was not pressurized. The gunners stood at open waist windows exposed to the screaming wind. The noise was deafening. The stress never stopped, and through it all the Memphis Belle crew kept going. Morgan decided the secret to a successful B-17 mission was tight formations, so tight the wings almost touched in flight. This required total focus and trust. A moment of inattention could cause a mid-air collision. The crew chief also deserves credit. Joe Gumbron from Hulnerville, Pennsylvania, took care of replacing 9 engines, both wings, 2 tails, both landing gear, and more to keep the Belle in top condition. While the flight crew got medals, and publicity ground crews like Jamron made it possible for the plane to keep flying. They worked through English winters, often outside performing maintenance and repair miracles. The Memphis Belle's survival was partly luck, but also Morgan's skill as a pilot and the professionalism of his crew. They worked together smoothly, each man knowing his job and doing it well, under extreme stress. This teamwork, this trust and skill made the difference between life and death. After completing their tour, several crew members wanted to keep fighting. Casmastel returned to the European theater after the publicity tour and finished 60 combat missions. John Quinlan tried unsuccessfully to fly again with Robert Morgan in the Pacific Theater, but was later sent to the China-Burma-India Theater, where he shot down 3 Zeros to become a gunner ace before his B-29 was shot down. These men, having survived the impossible, once chose to face it again. Morgan himself flew a second combat tour in the Pacific Theater, commanding a B-29 Superfortress named Dauntless Doi that led the first B-29 raid on Tokyo on November 24, 1944. The story of the Memphis Belle is ultimately about ordinary Americans doing extraordinary things. None of these men were born heroes. They were farm boys and factory workers, students and salesmen. They volunteered, or were drafted, went through training, and found themselves in the deadliest air war in history, and they rose to the challenge. They did not see themselves as heroes. In interviews after the war, they consistently deflected praise, talked about doing their jobs, and emphasized the contributions of others. This humility, this reluctance to claim special status, was typical of their generation. They did what had to be done, and that was enough. But we can recognize what they achieved even if they could not. They flew into death 24 times and returned. They helped prove that daylight precision bombing could work, even if the original plan needed major changes. They inspired a nation that needed hope in the dark days of early 1943. They became symbols of American determination and courage. Today, the Memphis Belle sits in the National Museum of the United States Air Force, restored to perfection. The plane represents as much symbolism for the Air Force in its fight over the war-torn skies of Europe as raising the American flag on Iwo Jima for the Marine Corps, or the USS Arizona Memorial at Pearl Harbor for the Navy. The bomber sits with bomb bay doors open, propellers attached nose art, shining mission markers, and fighter kill symbols are painted on the fuselage. Every rivet panel and instrument has been carefully restored. It looks as it did on that May Day in 1943, when it returned from Lauron for the last time. But this is not the Hollywood version. This is not a simple story of heroic Americans easily defeating evil Germans. This is a story of young men barely out of their teens who climbed into aluminum planes every few days and flew into the heart of the most concentrated air defenses. In history, men who knew they probably would not survive statistically. Men who did it anyway because it had to be done. The real story of the Memphis Belle is not just about one crew beating the odds. It is about what that achievement meant to everyone else still fighting. In late 1942 and early 1943, when bomber losses were catastrophic and survival seemed impossible, the Memphis Belle crew kept flying and kept surviving. They became proof that it could be done. They became hope for all the other crews still flying missions, still facing those terrible odds. And when they finished their combat tour and returned to the United States, they carried that hope with them. At every bond rally, at every factory, at every training base they visited, they were living proof that survival was possible. They were evidence that American air power could reach into the heart of Nazi Germany and come home. They were, in the most literal sense, flying propaganda, but propaganda based on truth. The Memphis Belle stands as a memorial to all who served in the strategic bombing campaign. This aircraft survived combat missions when survival seemed statistically impossible. It carried 10 men through the most concentrated anti-aircraft fire and fighter opposition in history and brought them all home. The young men who flew this bomber did not think of themselves as heroes, but they were. And the Memphis Belle, beautifully restored and honored, ensures that their story will never be forgotten. When visitors walk through the National Museum of the United States Air Force and see this aluminum bird meticulously restored to its 1943 configuration, they are looking at more than just an airplane. They are looking at a symbol of courage, sacrifice, and the terrible cost of freedom. They should remember that this aircraft represents thousands of other bombers that did not survive. They should remember the tens of thousands of airmen who died in the skies over Europe. They should remember the courage it took to climb into these aircraft day after day, knowing the odds, knowing that statistically they would not survive, and doing it anyway because it was their duty. The Memphis Belle's legacy extends beyond World War II. It influenced how America thinks about air power, about strategic bombing, about the men who fly into harm's way. It became part of the American story, a chapter in the narrative of the greatest generation. It inspired books, films, documentaries, and countless articles. It captured the imagination of the American people in 1943 and continues to do so today. The aircraft itself is one of only a handful of B-17Fs still in existence. Most were scrapped after the war. Those that survived often ended as gate guards or were modified beyond recognition. The Memphis Belle, through a combination of fame, luck, and the efforts of dedicated people over decades, survived largely intact. Its restoration allows current and future generations to see what these aircraft actually looked like, to understand their size and complexity, to appreciate the technology and engineering that went into them. The 10 crew members who flew the Memphis Belle to completion of their tour were among the lucky ones. They survived. They came home. They had lives and families and careers, but they never forgot their time over Europe, never forgot the friends who did not make it back, never forgot what it felt like to fly through flak. And fighters never forgot the fear and the adrenaline and the bone-deep exhaustion. In the end, the real story of the Memphis Belle is about all the crews, all the aircraft, all the missions. It is about the strategic bombing campaign that helped win World War II. It is about the cost of that victory measured not just in aircraft lost or bombs dropped, but in lives forever changed, in young men aged beyond their years, in families who lost sons and brothers and fathers. The Memphis Belle stands as witness to all of this, and every visitor who walks past this beautifully restored aircraft should pause and reflect on what it represents: the courage, the sacrifice, and the indomitable spirit of the men who flew into the flak-filled skies of World War II and against all odds came